Francis Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 1 through 4, lecture 3. Previous two lectures, I talked about chapters 1 through 3, which were more general in character. Chapter 4 begins his discussion of the state building in Europe in the modern times, and it is entitled Prussia Builds a State. For Fukuyama, in Europe, Prussia, which is the core of what later becomes Germany, is the preeminent example of competent state building. So that's why he focuses on it. Now, Germany today has a very strong state, a highly competent bureaucracy. And this bureaucracy dates back to the 1800s. It long predates democracy in Germany. And as you know, Germany doesn't really become a democracy until after World War II. Now, during the 1800s, Prussia and then Germany was, of course, technically an authoritarian country. You did not have formal mechanisms of accountability, but nonetheless, the German emperor, or the Prussian ruler before that, ruled through an institutionalized bureaucracy that incorporated within it a very strong legal system. So you end up with what's called a Rechtsstaat, or a liberal autocracy, meaning a form of government where there is no democratic accountability, but where the rights of citizens are to a large extent protected by a kind of uniform and impersonal administration of justice. So it's a very it's a curious combination in terms of Acemoglu and Robinson and Why Nations Failed. This would be something close to the idea of a sort of semi-inclusive economy, but with extractive political institutions, although that's only partially the case. But this liberal autocracy in Prussia and later Germany proved quite adept at fostering economic development because of the way that it reliably protected property rights and enforced contracts and things such as that. So, Germany, or what becomes Germany, Prussia, industrially grows significantly, becomes quite powerful in the 1800s, much to the chagrin of many of the nations around it. But again, Germany did not become a real democracy until, roughly 1949. It was a totalitarian dictatorship for a while there. And, before that, it was an autocracy, leaving aside the difficult case of the Weimar period. Now, the building of Germany's strong state was a result primarily of military competition. The fragmented German-speaking lands were gradually consolidated over time by canny rulers in Prussia who managed both to dominate their own aristocrats, the Junkers. They kind of kept the aristocrats in line, while building a competent military bureaucracy. And hence you get this quip about Prussia that it is an army with a country, as opposed to the other way around. And this is what he talks about on page 68 and thereafter, where, the kind of geographically exposed position of Prussia, the exposed position of Germany over time, meant that there was a lot of military pressure on Germany or on Prussia to secure itself. And the pressure of war, alongside with the divided aristocracy, the fact that the aristocracy is not a powerful counterweight to the emperor and the bureaucracy, leads to the building of a competent state. And it begins in the military bureaucracy, and then the civil bureaucracy catches up over time. And in that sense, it's not that different from the building of imperial China, a couple thousand years earlier with the Qin state, where and before that during the Warring States period, where dominance was established through, in the first place, the professionalization of the military, and then that spills over into the civilian administration with things like tax collection and all that. So it starts with the military. Now, during the the early 1800s and in Prussia, this bureaucracy was partly meritocratic and still partly patrimonial because the Junkers were powerful. So this isn't a fully kind of professionalized meritocratic modern bureaucracy, but it's on its way to it. And one of the important things that moves it in that direction is Napoleon. That he has the section History Ends in Prussia, right? That Napoleon sweeps through in 1806. Obviously, he's not there forever. He's followed later on by the Stein-Hardenberg reforms, which is after well after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But these reforms kind of transform the civil and military bureaucracies into genuine meritocracies, open to talent, where you need certain educational credentials and things like that. So Russia really does build this kind of competent bureaucracy. Now, neither the civil nor the military bureaucracies were democratically accountable because Prussia is not a democracy. But nonetheless, they're very regular. Right, and they're not arbitrary and despotic in the way that they function. They're very regular in the way that they function, and that's why you get, which he talks about in 72 and thereafter. It's why you get the Rechtsstaat. So because the bureaucracy in Prussia gives you rule of law in a sense, and it gives you non-arbitrary treatment of people. So you have something like impartial administration of justice, impartial administration of government, though under an authoritarian government. And in fact, the bureaucracy serves in a way to constrain the monarch, because the monarch, in order to govern, needs the bureaucracy, relies upon the bureaucracy, but can't, fully control it. The emperor can't sort of get down into the details of how the bureaucracy is functioning. So there's a way in which both the decisions and the arbitrariness, or the potential arbitrariness of the monarch, is restrained by the fact that the monarch has to govern through this impersonal or largely impersonal bureaucracy. So that's what gives you this Rechtsstaat. Therefore, the state, the apparatus of government, becomes increasingly kind of impersonal over time. The government is not seen as the personal property of the emperor or the monarch's dynasty, but more as sort of representing the community and being an instrument of the community as a whole and not of some particular privileged part of the community. So you get this sort of impersonal state, even though it's not democratic. It's not elected by or representative of the people in any formal sense, but nonetheless is seen as a governing power for the nation, as opposed to just being part of the power held by particular elites. You can read, if you dare, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, his discussion of bureaucracy, which, this is written in the late 1820s when this kind of bureaucracy is being formed. You can see a very sophisticated account of this there. Now, this leads on page 75, this discussion of what he calls bureaucratic autonomy and the paradox of democratic accountability. Now, he doesn't really go anywhere with this right now, except to use Prussia in order to illustrate this issue. That now, when you're talking about an autonomous institution, an institution is autonomous when it has its own interests and kind of values that are distinguishable from those of other institutions and other social forces. That's when, instead of being the instrument of some other group, you are your own institution, where you have your own particular interests, your particular principles that makes you distinct from other organizations, not an appendage of some organization. So you think about, the institutionalization of the legal system, that judges follow judicial norms, not political norms. In the same way, officers follow certain norms with regard to military command that aren't the same as, political principles and so on. So institutional autonomy is very important for the functioning of good institutions. It gives them integrity. And after Frederick the Great, Prussian bureaucrats become increasingly autonomous, right? It's so much so that there's a kind of core of the character of the Russian bureaucracy that manages to survive the Nazi era and into the present day, that the Nazis did not manage to completely co-opt this bureaucracy, even though they tried. And this is something that Carl Schmitt talks about in some of his writings. I think it was Carl Schmitt who sort of famously said on the day that Hitler assumed power, he said that was the day that Hegel died. Because Hegel is seen as the preeminent philosophic representative of and defender of the Rechtsstaat based on impersonal, rational administration of society, whereas the principle of the Nazis is really the principle of the political party and subordinating the nation to the principles of the Nazi party. And so the takeover of the Nazis was seen at the time as a kind of repudiation of that earlier sort of impersonal approach to bureaucratic rule. But the Nazis were not completely successful in rooting out that kind of spirit of Prussian bureaucracy. It survives afterwards. But nonetheless, autonomous bureaucracies can present what's called the principal agent problem. And this is something that I talked about in an earlier part of the class. The principal is the person who is primarily in charge of making decisions. The agent is the person, or group, obviously, that's responsible for implementing those decisions. And the principal agent problem refers to the problem of how can a principal be sure that the agent is actually ultimately responsive to the interests or the commands of the principal. If I delegate authority to you to do something for me, what can I do to make sure that you actually do what I want you to do instead of something else? That's the principal agent problem. Obviously, a classic example of the principal agent problem is the governing of faraway provinces, say in the Roman Empire, even in the Chinese Empire, where the central authorities were reliant upon provincial governors, but they were provincial governors that they couldn't always keep track of. Right, especially back, in the days before digital technology and all of that kind of stuff. If somebody's 1,000 miles away, it's really hard to keep track of them to make sure that they're staying in line and doing what they're supposed to do and not something else. So that's an example of the principal agent problem. How can you make sure that the agent is ultimately accountable to the principal? As Fukuyama says on page 76, quote, in a well-functioning political system, the agent should have enough autonomy to do its job well, right? So in other words, the people who are doing the actual governing, they need to have enough autonomy to govern in a proper way. They shouldn't be micromanaged by people higher up who don't have the same competence. Nonetheless, he said, but should also remain ultimately accountable to the principal. So in other words, bureaucratic institutions should be autonomous enough to be able to fulfill their tasks in a competent, efficient, professional manner. But at the same time, they ultimately need to be accountable to politicians, or through politicians accountable to the people. So how can you actually control the bureaucrats? This is a little bit different from the question of how do you guard the guardians? But it's how do you keep bureaucrats accountable while still making sure that they are autonomous enough to be able to do their job well and professionally. And this is a thorny problem and has been for a long time. Now, the problem in Prussia and later in Germany was that the military, according to Fukuyama, again, these are somewhat debatable historical claims, but there's evidence behind them for sure. His claim is that the military became so autonomous as an institution that it more or less ended up being able to run foreign policy during the World War I era. That's obviously an example of too much bureaucratic autonomy. The idea being that the political leaders of the nation are the ones that should be ultimately in charge of setting foreign policy, and the military should be part of the governmental apparatus that carries out that policy, but it shouldn't be the one making the policy. That's akin to letting other bureaucratic institutions write the laws instead of Congress. And of course, spoiler alert, that happens. Now, so the upshot that he brings from his discussion of Prussia, because obviously then you have, after the Nazi era, Germany does become democratic, and it's able to retain that very competent state. So when it becomes democratic, it has that competent state. And so in the case of Prussia/Germany, you have an example of a strong state that is built up via military competition prior to any democratization and surviving the process of democratization. So strong state first, then democracy. That seems to work, and Prussia is not the only example of this. But some states get democracy first before they get a strong state, and oftentimes end up getting a corrupt state as a result, right? It might seem somewhat paradoxical, but the argument that he makes is, in effect, premature democratization. Democratization before you have a competent state will actually lead to a corruption of the state rather than making it sort of competently responsive to the good of the people. And that's what he talks about in the next several chapters, which I'll be talking about in my next set of lectures. So Prussia, in terms of sequencing for Fukuyama, Prussia is the one that gets it right, or Germany is the one that gets it right. Build the competent state first, then democratize. And to show why that is, in the subsequent chapters, we see that when you try to reverse the process, democratize first and then build the state, you get a different, usually more corrupt outcome. Although, of course, not always. You could say, for example, the United States would be an example of democratization prior to state building. But, the story is a little bit different in the US for reasons that we'll get to later.